Our words of the week this week come from a personal favorite verse of mine. It's in Romans chapter 14, verse 1. And we're going to look at it in 4 different English translations before we dig into the Greek. Let's start with the ESV. As for the one who is weak in the faith, welcome him, but not to quarrel over opinions. We'll go on to the NIV. Accept the one whose faith is weak, without quarreling over disputable matters. Now the RSV. As for the man who is weak in faith, welcome him, but not for disputes over opinions. And finally the NASB. Now accept the one who is weak in faith, but not for the purpose of passing judgment on his opinions. There's quite a bit of variability in those translations, even though the thrust of the message is consistent. Let's take a look at it in Koine and see what we can find out. Tonde astenunta te piste pros lambaneste. We'll read the second half in a moment. Let's unpack the first half first. So, tonde astenunta, we see the de as the post positive, the second word. That's but, and or but. And now we're going to jump to the end of the phrase and get our verb, pros lambaneste. This is a second person plural imperative, a command, and it means to welcome. And so pros, before, and lambano, receive. It's a public reception. It's openly receive. And then we have to go back to ton astenunta, which is a participle with the article. The weak, the one who is weak, te piste, in the faith. So, he says to us, but welcome the one who is weak in the faith, but you, plural, so he's speaking to the community, welcome, publicly receive the one who is weak in the faith. Now let's go to the second half of the verse. Me eis diakrises dialogismon. So, me is not, and then eis is to, for, or unto, but frequently it's used to indicate either purpose or result. We use that preposition to introduce like a purpose clause. But here we lack a verb in the second half of the clause, so we have to rely on our previous verb. We have to supply one, and the logical one seems to be the previous verb, the welcoming, the imperative, the command to welcome the one who is weak in the faith. So, but not to do what? Not for the purpose of what? Diakrises, differentiating or differentiation, dialogismon, of thoughts or reasoning or opinions. So welcome in the one who is weak in the faith, but not for the purpose of differentiating opinions, not for the purpose of deciding who's right in their practices. Let's talk about a couple of points. Ton astenunta te piste, the phrase, the one who is weak in the faith. This tells us something significant. In Paul's opinion, as he communicates to the church in Rome, there are genuine believers who are weak in the faith and who are to be welcomed with open arms. Not allowed to slip in through the back door, not given some second tier seat in the balcony, but to be welcomed in publicly. Pros lambaneste. Welcome them in publicly. So for Paul, the imperative call tells us that we're not to write people off because in our perception there's a weakness to their faith. They are weak in the faith. They don't do things, they're not as faithful as we are, or they don't practice in the same manner as either we do or as we would prescribe for them. The second thing is, we're told specifically that this welcoming is not for the purpose of correcting them. This is a real challenge, isn't it? He says there are, in fact, thoughts and opinions about practice that can differ among sincere believers. We can be sincere believers and still hold some different practices and different thoughts. Let's take a closer look at the two words that form that phrase. So diakrises is the accusative feminine plural, and it is a noun, and it means divisions, disputes, or distinctions. And then our second noun is dialogismon, which is a genitive masculine plural noun, and because it's in the genitive, it means of opinions, of thoughts, or of reasonings. So not for the purpose of divisions or disputes of opinions or of reasonings or of thoughts. So the reason to welcome them in is not so that you can straighten out their wrong think. That's pretty interesting. Not everyone has to see everything the same way. Your fellow believers, now this is where it's going to get a little dicey. You're going to say, you're going from talking about Greek to meddling. And I might be meddling just a little bit. Your fellow believers are Christ followers, not you followers. You don't have to deal with their views regarding things, now this is critical, regarding things that are open to opinion. Paul is very clear, all the gospel writers are very clear that there are some things that are not open to opinion, like the fact that the wages of sin is death, that we're all headed for the same outcome. There is no difference, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. That the only means of salvation is through the sacrificial death of a sinless one, namely Christ, who dies in your place, who goes to the grave in your place, and who rises to newness of life to provide you with newness of life. He's not talking about any of that. He's talking about things that are open to dispute or opinion, things that are open to reasoning about and making conclusions independently. And he gives us, in the chapter, he gives us two very concrete examples that are going to illustrate for us. But why is this so important? That Paul wrote essentially a whole chapter about these kind of divisions. Because people are naturally afraid of divergent views. If we get together and we're both part of the same group, but you do things one way and I do things another way, my assumption is that your way of doing it is somehow either an indictment on the way that I do it, or if I don't correct you, I'm endorsing error. Right? That's natural human nature. We don't want that. We don't want to be responsible for you doing it wrong, and we don't want to learn that we're doing it wrong based on watching you do something differently. So Paul writes this whole chapter to clear us in on that. But I want to reiterate the two things that he talks about in Romans 14 are not salvation issues, they are practice issues. And specifically, he talks about diet and he talks about Sabbath keeping. He specifically says in verse 2 that the weak in the faith eat only vegetables. And I want to be crystal clear, there's not a vegetarian movement in Rome in the first century. This is not about animal rights. This is not about principles of healthier living. This is purely a cultic concern. This is a religious concern. In a big city where you're not doing farming on your own, where you're not trading with your neighbors for vegetables and meat, etc., all meat is presumably sacrificed to some deity. So if you go to the market to buy lamb or goat or whatever meat you would be eating, you can safely assume it has been sacrificed at some temple before becoming available in the market. So there are people that Paul describes as weak in the faith who say, I can't eat that because to eat that would be to honor some pagan deity, and I won't do that. Paul also says we know that an idol is nothing in the world, right? So his reasoning is whatever happened to that meat before I bought it has nothing to do with me. But there are people whose consciences won't let them eat that meat. So that's the kind of issue at hand. He also says there are some people who hold to a specific day. There are Jewish Christians who are Sabbath keepers. And he says there are other people who see all days as being the same. And those are the two examples he gives for disputable matters or questions of opinions, of these differentiations among ideas or thoughts. Two people come to the table. One says, I can't eat that because I don't know its history. The other person comes along and says, I give thanks to God for the food that he provides for me, and whatever somebody may have done to it before it hit the market has nothing to do with me and my faith. That's the issue at hand. He says that both are doing what they're doing in an attempt to honor God as best they understand it. And he also says that it's not up to me to judge another person's servant. So the person who's serving God is God's servant, not my servant. It's not up to me to go over and say, you're dishonoring God by not eating that, or you're dishonoring God by eating that. If that person is sincerely honoring God in their practice, that's between them and their master, not between them and me. Pretty interesting, pretty powerful stuff. Let's read verse 6 from Romans 14 together. This is from the ESV. The one who observes the day observes it in honor of the Lord. The one who eats, eats in honor of the Lord, since he gives thanks to God. While the one who abstains, abstains in honor of the Lord and gives thanks to God. So people of good conscience can have different practices, but both are sincerely following the same God. If that can be said, then there's no reason for me to be concerned that your practice differs slightly from my practice in regard to those matters that are subject to opinion or are disputable, right? We're not talking about whether the divinity of Christ versus Christ being a created being. We're not talking about sins that are delineated in Scripture as to whether or not they're still sins. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about matters of practice. We would go a long way in applying this outside of the faith realm and say there are things that we can dispute and not everybody has to hold the same view. I don't have to conform to your pattern in order for me to be a legitimate person, and you don't have to conform to my pattern in order to be a legitimate person as far as these disputable matters go. So our words of the week this week, diakrises, dialogismon, divisions of opinions. Don't fight over divisions of opinions. Don't welcome people in for the purpose of correcting their wrongthink in your opinion. Great verse, great passage. I encourage you to read all of chapter 14 of Romans. It's pretty magnificent. There's a little bit at the end of 13 and it goes into 15, but suffice it to say, I think you can get the thrust of Paul's argument here if you just read the entirety of Romans 14. Thanks for watching. Until next time, Karis Kai Irene Humine. Grace and peace to you.